Hello, this is Stacy Behrens, and today I will be presenting on the IQ model with gifted and diverse students. This presentation is for SPED 851 Theories and Models in Gifted Education for Fort Hays State University. I decided to stick with my original theorist, Lewis Terman, who is the father of gifted education, and his IQ model of intelligence. You might remember he had a longitudinal study of children for over 50 years, and he also developed the Stanford-Binet Intelligence Scale in 1916. First off, there were some good things that Lewis Terman did. He basically promoted gifted education. Since he's the father of it, he got things going. He eliminated the negative stereotypes that many highly intellectual students at that time faced. He also developed an easy, objective, fast identification process. And his testing of IQ or other forms similar are still used today. However, we can probably all agree that just using an IQ score is kind of discriminatory, and obviously his first study was in 1916. Most in his study were white, only a handful of his children were not white students. They were identified by teachers who were then tested with the IQ tests, and those are the ones who were chosen for the study. If we consider the time period in the United States, shortly before World War I, and then you had World War II, some groups were looked down upon in our country. This was also decades before the Civil Rights Movement, before women's advancement in education. So obviously, there were groups that were underrepresented in his study, and there are also groups that are underrepresented today. So this video is mostly going to focus on why his model of testing with IQ only is not the best, and how it discriminates against some groups. And also I'm going to talk about some of the inequalities and needs that these diverse learners need. First off, we're talking about male versus female. Yes, there's been a lot of progress from 1916 to today. It's amazing how far women have come in educational world. But the articles that I read also talked about the equity has been slow. Some of the studies that were pointed out, there's bias when we as teachers recommend students for gifted education, male versus female. In a study of 2011 by Bianco, they found that 77% referred males to only 54% referring females to gifted education. And this also kind of models Terman's study in 1916, where there were 12% less women in his study even at that time. Actually, I was a little surprised there were as many women as there were in that time period. Some of the stereotypes that the study talked about was that often girls are discouraged from advanced learning and maybe encouraged to take on more helping, caring, or family roles. They talked about how math and science, there is still that negative stereotype that girls are not as strong in those areas, so that eliminates as many of those students getting nominated in the gifted education for those areas. And then this also goes against Terman's early ideas, where he found his students to be superior in almost every way. It kind of, for decades, negated the need for counseling. And so even for females, we can see how maybe they need encouragement or counseling to pursue some of these degrees that would match their ability levels. The study also talked about why potentially there were less females being represented. In Libby Lee's article in 2002, she talked about how at an early age, girls are taught teacher-pleasing behavior, or they master them earlier. They blend in. They don't draw attention to themselves as much, whether it be verbal outbursts. They take on less leadership roles in the classroom. And furthermore, they're even asked to help others in the classroom, which takes away from their increased learning time and their intense study on their goals. And all of these factors kind of work together to underrepresent females in the gifted programs. And then another group to talk about is culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse children, or the acronym CLED. These are the students that are often less identified for gifted education. Sadly, many teachers or adults assume they need basic skills or remediation classes instead of gifted. They often face more strict discipline in schools, It talked about how they lack mainstream culture access in their early learning environments, and that while many gifted students have opportunity to advance their abilities and their goals, that many of these students were never able to develop their talents for lack of resources in their homes. And so it's not a surprise that many of these students naturally do not test as well without practice. And then I put a quote on the top there. There is a negative relationship between the percentage of free and reduced lunch students and the percentage of students identified as gifted. So we can see that poverty does play a factor in that for sure. Another publication, Seven Students, One Voice, had students of color and or low income who talked about the needs that they face and what it was like to be gifted. They expressed that often teachers or adults have sadly lower expectations for them, whether they didn't think they could achieve as much as they did, or they accused them of cheating when they did do something that was impressive. They also expressed that parents often were not able to help. Think of ELL students not able to translate, not able to help with homework, especially in their early grades, was a factor. They also expressed that these students need to be taught how to advocate for themselves, which was a very important skill in school and also outside of school. And then they explained the need to navigate the conflicting assumptions that they faced. So on one hand, you had people thinking that they were capable of less, and then you also had that gifted label and they expected more, and it was hard to navigate between these two conflicting assumptions of people. They did positively talk about teachers changing their lives, however, that they needed someone to push them, someone to celebrate success with them, help them find peer groups, people who were like-minded to work with, someone to provide extra resources and opportunities they wouldn't naturally be given, and just someone in general to believe in them. A further study in 2010 in UC Berkeley, they did a case study on a Midwestern magnet school, and the practices protected the advantage of whiteness was the quote that I kind of summed up from that. They looked at whiteness was almost a form of property, and they used it to create inequalities for other learners in the school. And there were big disparities between achievement and gifted identification between white students and those who were not white. 91% were identified by test scores only, which talked about obviously some groups naturally do not test as strong. And it also talked about that when students are identified for gifted as young as kindergarten, this typically favors white and middle class students more than other students. In the National Association for Gifted Children in 2026, it talked about better assessment strategies. So we can all agree probably that Lewis Terman in 1916, that was a long time ago, he did some good things, but by IQ scores only, you're not going to have all groups represented equally as they should be. Equally or equitably would be a better word for that. This study talked about how when you assess someone for gifted, that your testing practices should be aligned with your definition of what giftedness is. You should include multiple assessments that are not biased against groups, so an IQ test only wouldn't do that. That all individuals doing the testing should have sufficient training in assessments, and they should all be fully informed of best practices and identification assessments. So while I'm talking more about why Lewis Terman's original theory is not the best for these groups, I could easily talk about other theorists who had better ideas, whether it be Renzulli's three-ring concept, where motivation and creativity is encouraged, and other models or other modes of identification, or even Gagne's model of talent development. Those would definitely be stronger tools than the early Lewis Terman's ideas. In conclusion, using just a test score, IQ, something similar to Lewis Terman's original ideas, is just not equitable for some students, and that as teachers, we play a crucial role in helping these other groups get identified or to receive the proper gifted services that they deserve. And then this is my reference page. I thank you all for listening.